What I want to talk about today is a topic, hot and dry energy and water in Georgia. This is an image I'm sure that we are all very familiar with. It's from the New York Times, 2007, Lake Lanier. And I like this picture for a lot of reasons, mainly because it demonstrates both subtly and also not so subtly the host of water supply problems that Georgia faced during its most recent drought of record. This, of course, is an image from the upper Apalachicola, Chattahoochee Flint River Basin. But this picture, this image also has a lot of things that are in some ways outside of the frame that all reveal many of the kind of competing water resource, kind of competing uses and users in this basin. You have these homeowners, municipal water treatment, sewage facilities, waste assimilation. They're kind of energy corporations and cooperatives, these things all outside kind of the frame, as well as commercial fishermen, farmers, golf courses. All these things that tie together just one of the region's river basins. Now, all these stakeholders, of course, are competing over a resource that in some ways we kind of popularly remember as one of the humid American South's abundant natural resources. This is, again, this water, this kind of one thing that we kind of think of as being very abundant in the South, a region renowned for floods, like in some ways that Gordon was talking about, as well as swamps and, again, the mosquitoes. So it kind of tying this together, why am I here today to talk to you about this kind of energy and water in Georgia? In some ways, I'm going to borrow a phrase from the famous environmentalist and former Sierra Club executive director, David Browler. I'm here in some ways because I'm for a river. It's not that I'm against anything, I'm actually for a river. And of course, it's not really one river in particular. I work for the Georgia River Network, so we're for many rivers. But I grew up exploring on the Potomac River's banks and was later enthralled by the kind of crystal clear streams in western North Carolina. But it was also there that I found reservoirs. Not quite as large as Lake Lanier, but I started kind of finding reservoirs all over the place and realized that a lot of them weren't the work of the Tennessee Valley Authority, kind of this thing that I thought was responsible for all the lakes and reservoirs in the South. So these kind of reservoirs I was finding everywhere were what really captivated my interest for most of the past decade. And so I'm here today because I learned that despite living in a wet and humid region, that river water has never been an assured natural resource in Georgia or other southern states. And so that kind of brings me back to this image. It illustrates what we might in some ways think of as a new southern problem. And I'm talking about in some ways that this problem of urban drought. When I was growing up, I always kind of had this image of drought. It was like some farmer with their hands, like soil and dirt leaking through their fingers. And that was what drought was. So what I want to talk about today is in some ways this new problem of urban drought. And that it's actually hit Georgia from metro Atlanta to its rural communities in the past on numerous occasions. And I'm just going to really talk about one example. And Georgians in each case would really sneak through and sneak by these droughts with help from their neighbors, certainly help from technology, as well as shifting environmental conditions. So in telling you about the history of urban drought, I'm also going to tell you a story about some of the choices that Georgians made before, during, and after drought events. In short, they thought that some new energy choices and technologies would in some ways drought-proof the South, but they were wrong, and they would learn that repeatedly. So again, I want to tell you this tale of urban drought and energy in the New South. It's kind of this period in the early 1900s, and I'll start in 1925 with a story about rivers, dams, transmission lines, and streetcars, plus a company that corralled all of these things together to energize Atlanta, which is, at the time in 1925, was a city of about 235,000 people. So in 1925, the Atlantic Journal-Constitution sounded the alarm that only 4 weeks' supply of water remained in northeast Georgia's artificial reservoirs. And talking about these reservoirs, this is the Tallulah Tugaloo Gorge up there by the Chattooga. So this is a cutaway view of the Tallulah Tugaloo River gorges. These are individual dams, reservoirs that Georgia Power Company built in the 1920s. So by 1925, this kind of significant drought was starting to really set in the South. By 1925, some of the nation's most celebrated and successful electric utility companies could call the American South's rivers their own. These companies, including the corporate ancestors of today's North Carolina Duke Energy and also our own Georgia Power Company, all of these companies had figured out how to kind of manipulate and twist these rivers beginning in the early 1900s. From the Catawba River in North Carolina to the Alabama River in that state, these monopolies would produce electricity primarily for textile factories, also ice machines, eventually elevators, and of course fans in the age before air conditioning. But in some ways, in an urban place like Atlanta, it was streetcar patrons, electric streetcars. These things, more than lighting consumers, these were the greatest engines of change for urban energy consumption. Because of this consumption and demand, Georgia Power Company would eventually raise these 5 dams in the Tallulah Tugaloo Gorge, again filling 5 artificial reservoirs between the years 1910 and 1927. This in some ways was one of the most highly developed kind of energy and water systems that existed in the country at the time. The company would store, again, this water behind dams like Tallulah, run the water through turbines to generate electricity, and then transmit that electricity over a network of wires more than 80 miles distant to Atlanta. The statewide drought in 1925 basically set the booming New South and Georgia Power back. Despite previous claims from Georgia Power Company officials that dams such as those in the Tallulah Tugaloo Project could conserve water supply through the, quote, severest of droughts, the 1925 drought presented a very different reality. Instead, executives would announce that a limited water supply remained in these kind of multiple, quote, giant hydroelectric reservoirs, as they were calling them. And the stories, these repeated stories that were starting to show up in the Journal-Constitution, or excuse me, the Atlanta Constitution at the time. One would even prompt a letter to the editor, one person writing that the Atlanta City Council should issue an order to stop residents from, quote, watering of lawns and washing of automobiles. Again, this is 1925. So the letter writer was not alone. As Georgia Power, losing water in these reservoirs, recognized they had to weigh in on the situation. They ran full-page public service announcements in the newspaper. Executives also reached out and began talking with regional managers of textile mills, brick factories, granite mining, and other industries. Basically, all these companies agreed to scale back and reduce their energy consumption and production during what was called a water supply crisis. Atlanta consumers, certainly streetcar patrons, would also allow this kind of disruption in their lives, and streetcar service would not resume until October of 1925. So all these kind of emergency measures, these kind of emergency conservation measures, primarily from an energy perspective, all worked. But it's important to also recognize that the region didn't just kind of pull out of this drought simply because it started raining, which it did in 1926 and 27. But there was another more technological reason why this region pulled out of its drought and this kind of energy crisis. So when Atlanta producers and consumers face this crisis, we have this thing called the when Atlanta producers and consumers face this kind of energy crisis that was clearly connected with drought, we have this interconnected New South superpower transmission network utility that ultimately averted more draconian orders. It's kind of hard to see on this map and the screen, but all these kind of you've got some green and red lines in here. This is like a high-tension transmission network that was one of the most comprehensive in the country at the time. That basically, connected all these different cities. This is Atlanta right in here. Like Charlotte, Raleigh, Birmingham over here. So this kind of interconnected utility grid, to the relief of many Georgia's industries, the state's energy companies imported electricity that was produced in Alabama and Tennessee in August of 1925. So basically, one of the nation's first major multi-state interconnected power grids enabled drought-free and water-rich areas in places like Alabama and Tennessee to share power with water-poor neighbors. So those with water ultimately rescued the New South's most the most modern city, a city that had grown utterly dependent on renewable energy sources. Right? So again, it's kind of thinking about areas, in Tennessee and northwestern Alabama. There's plenty of water there. They were able to generate electricity and kind of ultimately pipe it in the direction of Atlanta. So these droughts in the 1920s not only highlighted the utility of interconnected grids like this one, they also revealed a water supply problem, the limits of hydropower, and in some ways, what we call a technological plateau. Georgia Power Company and other energy company executives had championed white coal, or water power and hydropower, as a solution to the Southeast's economic development and energy independence, or kind of this thirst for energy independence for decades before 1925. But it would be after this drought of 1925 that energy utilities no longer accepted hydroelectric dams as the energy generating standard. So it was after 1925, we see companies start moving away from this fickle supply of white coal. Companies like Georgia Power and Duke would begin building more and more coal-fired steam plants to generate electricity, including plants Atkinson on the Chattahoochee and Arkwright on the Ocmulgee. These new black coal plants still required water for cooling, but the coal-burning plants could typically generate more electricity with less water than could hydroelectric dams or facilities. Right? So, perfect. So what? What do these droughts tell us? I think they tell us three things. First, we can kind of see this energy-water nexus has a long history in the American South. More recently, the Union of Concerned Scientists visited Georgia to talk about this intersection of water supply and energy production. And the thrust of their argument was that when communities talk about building new electrical power plants and supplies, they generally are not thinking or talking about water supplies. So again, kind of what I hope you kind of get out of this is this idea that understanding that there is this long history of energy and this long history of the energy and water nexus exists here in Georgia, and in many ways it's old news. Georgia Power and the Southern Company have a long history of investment and dependence on the state's water to produce their product. This kind of, all the Georgia Power and many other energy companies learned a long time ago that energy was a riddle. Renewables are cheap and clean, but and have unfortunately not always been reliable. But they have also learned that renewables are ultimately a critical part of their energy mix and their own energy security. The second piece, real quickly, is that we also see that there's a long and old history of conservation in Georgia in the context of energy and water. People in Atlanta recognized that a long time ago, and not just in Atlanta. There have been and will always be compelling arguments and reasons, both fiscal, technological, and moral, that kind of push us to embrace energy and water efficiency. And our history tells us this. Our past also reminds us that there was a time when major utilities did everything they could to enlist consumer support and sacrifice to ensure brighter futures, and unfortunately those days appear to be behind us. And the final thing I'll also say is that we really can't drought-proof the South. As the past has demonstrated, any attempt or success at doing so will be temporary and will produce a false sense of security. And we also can't drought-proof the South if it means that one community continues to benefit at the expense of others. And that's where I'll end. Thanks very much.